I ended up tearing up $1 million check, a consequence of my son's deliberate lie about his wedding date. I was left completely alone in a silent restaurant while he celebrated without me. That night, I discovered his betrayal, a calculated effort to erase me from his life. Now, he's about to face the consequences of that choice. I gave my bow tie one last tug before I walked through the pavilion's grand mahogany doors. It was exactly 6 o'clock, just as David had instructed. The heavy gift box in my left hand was a constant reminder of the check tucked inside, a gift I hoped would guarantee my son's success. The bouquet of white roses I held in my other hand trembled slightly as I imagined his surprise. But the first thing that greeted me was the profound silence. The crystal chandeliers cast their usual warm glow over empty tables draped in pristine white cloth. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Central Park stretched out, bathed in the golden light of the spring evening. Yet, not a single guest occupied the elegant dining chairs. There were no floral arrangements, no wedding arch, no sign of any celebration at all. My patent leather shoes echoed against the marble floors as I moved deeper into the space, checking each section. I thought maybe they had moved the ceremony to the private dining room, but that room was also empty, with chairs pushed neatly under the tables. I stopped and approached the hostess station, where a young man in a black uniform was polishing wine glasses. I explained that I was looking for the Harris wedding reception. He calmly informed me that they had no events scheduled for that night. I insisted that couldn't be right. I explained that my son, David Harris, had reserved the venue months before. I mentioned that the wedding ceremony was scheduled for 5:30, with the reception starting at 6 o'clock. The young man's expression shifted to professional concern. He told me he would get his manager. James Miller appeared within minutes, a man I had dealt with personally when I booked corporate dinners. His face showed genuine confusion as he checked something on his tablet. He apologized, but told me that their event calendar showed no weddings today. He asked if I was certain about the date. I pulled the heavy invitation from my inside jacket pocket, unfolding the cream-colored paper with the embossed gold lettering. Every detail seemed to be exactly as I remembered. It said Saturday, April 26, 2025, 6 in the evening. The Grand Pavilion, Manhattan. I insisted everything was correct and held the invitation toward him. I reminded him that David had told me to be there at 6 o'clock sharp. Miller studied the invitation, his forehead creasing with confusion. He mentioned that it was quite puzzling and wondered if perhaps there was a venue change or a scheduling error. The gift box suddenly felt heavier in my hands. I had never been late to anything important in my 68 years. My wife, Maria, used to joke that I had arrived early for my own birth. David knew this about me. He had always known. My throat felt dry despite the restaurant's perfect climate control. I asked if he would double-check his system. Miller nodded and disappeared behind the host station. I stood there in my formal attire, surrounded by empty elegance, while the Saturday evening in Manhattan hummed beyond the windows. I imagined other families were probably gathering for dinner right now, sharing stories and laughter. Miller returned, shaking his head slowly. He had checked everything twice, he told me. He confirmed there were no Harris events scheduled for today, yesterday, or tomorrow. I folded the invitation back into my pocket, my hand steadier than I felt inside. Something was terribly wrong, and I was determined to find out exactly what. The restaurant's warmth followed me onto Fifth Avenue, but the spring coolness helped clear my head. I needed to have this conversation in private. Whatever had gone wrong was family business. My fingers trembled slightly as I scrolled through contacts to find David's number. I looked into the car through the window, where the gift box sat on the passenger seat and the white roses were scattered across the black leather. Everything I had prepared for this moment was waiting and used. The phone rang 3 times before his voice came through, casual and distracted. He greeted me and asked what was going on. I told him I was outside the Grand Pavilion and that there was absolutely nobody here. I paced the narrow space between parked cars, my formal shoes clicking against the asphalt. There was a pause, and then he said, with no urgency, that the wedding had been yesterday and that he was sorry I had missed it. I stopped walking. I asked what he meant by yesterday. He explained that it was Friday night, a beautiful ceremony. He told me that Emily had looked amazing. His tone carried no concern that his own father had apparently missed his only son's wedding. I asked how it could have been yesterday. I told him I had the invitation with me, and it said Saturday, April 26th. He said he didn't know what had happened with the invitations and suggested it might have been a printing error. He said that these things happen with wedding vendors. 40 years in business had taught me to recognize a lie, and my son had just told me a spectacular one. I told him not to hang up and to explain everything to me. He replied that he was in the middle of something and asked if he could call me back later tonight or tomorrow. The casualness in his voice cut deeper than anger could have. This was not panic about a missed invitation or guilt over a genuine mistake. This was dismissal. I knew that 500 people had received correct invitations for yesterday, but mine alone had the wrong date. He said that wedding planning was stressful and that things get mixed up. I insisted that nothing gets mixed up when it matters. David knew that about me. Silence stretched between us, filled only by Manhattan traffic and my own controlled breathing. Through the restaurant's windows, I could see Miller still standing at his station, probably wondering about the confused old man in the tuxedo. David said that he really needed to go and that Emily's family was there. He knew that Emily's family had the correct date. When David spoke again, his voice had hardened slightly. He said that he didn't know what I wanted him to say. He confirmed that the wedding had happened, that it was perfect, and he apologized for the confusion with my invitation. I repeated the word confusion carefully, tasting its insufficiency. I told him I would call him tomorrow and figure it all out then. The line went dead. I stood on the sidewalk, phone still pressed to my ear, watching normal people walk past with their normal Saturday evening plans. A jogger rounded the corner, and a couple walked by with takeout bags. Life continued around me while mine had just shifted fundamentally. I got into my car and sat there for several minutes before starting the engine, processing what David's voice had revealed. It was not confusion, not an accident. It was deliberate deception. The drive to my apartment took 20 minutes through Manhattan's evening traffic. I used the time to think, with my formal jacket draped across the back seat and my bow tie loosened around my collar. By the time I reached the Upper East Side, my initial shock had crystallized into something colder and more productive. Inside my study, family photographs lined the mahogany shelves. I saw pictures of Maria and me at various corporate events, David's graduation from Columbia, and holidays when he still seemed proud to be my son. I pulled out my phone, realizing I needed evidence of what David had told me. Finding Emily's Instagram account took several attempts. Technology had never been my strong suit, but there they were. Dozens of photographs from yesterday's celebration. The grand pavilion dining room I had just left empty was now filled with flowers and laughter. Emily was in an ivory gown that probably cost more than most people's cars. David was in his tuxedo, beaming beside the wedding cake I had helped pay for. I scrolled through faces I recognized. Tom Anderson from the Chamber of Commerce. Sarah Johnson from the Country Club. My own lawyer, Marcus Allen, raising a champagne toast. Every single person in those photographs had received the correct date for my son's wedding. Every person except his father. The gift box sat where I had placed it on my desk, its ribbons slightly crushed from the evening's events. I unwrapped it slowly, revealing the leather portfolio containing my wedding present, a cashier's check for $1 million. It was David's startup capital, his freedom from the student loans that still burdened his generation, his ticket to independence. Independence. That was what this was really about. I held the check up to the desk lamp's light, examining the careful calligraphy of the amount. It was money I had earned building Harris Properties from nothing, growing it into Manhattan's most respected real estate firm. It was money David had always expected but never quite appreciated. My phone buzzed with a text message. Sorry about the confusion tonight, Dad. Let's grab lunch next week and catch up. Catch up, as if his wedding was equivalent to missing a baseball game. I walked to the window overlooking Central Park, where families were finishing their Saturday evening activities. Children played on distant playgrounds while parents watched protectively. Some of those parents had probably attended David's wedding yesterday, maybe wondering where the groom's father had gone. The answer was simple. David was ashamed of me. My rough edges, my direct manner, my old-school approach to business. None of it fit the polished image he had cultivated for his media agency. His clients preferred the sanitized version of success, not the man who had actually built it from construction sites and late-night negotiations. I returned to my desk and set the check down carefully. $1 million represented months of careful financial planning, the liquidation of certain investments, the deliberate structuring of what I had intended as the most generous wedding gift a father could give. David had wanted my money, but not my presence. The photographs on my shelf seemed different now. They weren't memories of a proud father and son, but documentation of a relationship that had apparently ended without my knowledge. Maria's absence felt heavier in the silence. She would have known how to handle this, would have found a way to bridge whatever gap had grown between David and me. But Maria was gone, and I was alone with the truth my son had worked so carefully to avoid telling me directly. I picked up the check one final time, studying my own signature authorizing the funds. If David wanted to pretend his father didn't exist, perhaps it was time to show him what that actually meant. The decision settled over me like a familiar coat, comfortable, necessary, and perfectly fitted to the man I had always been. Back in my study, I placed the check on my desk blotter and stared at it for a long moment. $1 million, the same amount Maria and I had saved for David's future when he was still young enough to hug his father without embarrassment. I walked to the kitchen and selected a bottle of Macallan 25, Maria's last Christmas gift to me. The crystal tumbler caught the desk lamp's light as I poured 2 fingers of scotch and returned to my chair. To new beginnings, I said aloud to Maria's photograph on the bookshelf. Her smile remained unchanged, captured at David's high school graduation, when we had both been so proud of our accomplished son. I picked up the check again. The paper felt substantial between my fingers, bank-grade stock that represented 40 years of building something meaningful. David had expected this money, probably counted on it. His casual dismissal on the phone suggested he believed he would weather any temporary displeasure from his father. That was his first mistake. I tore the check slowly, deliberately, starting from one corner and working across. The sound was surprisingly satisfying, a crisp snap that echoed in the quiet room. I continued until the pieces were too small to reconstruct, then gathered them into the original envelope. The scotch burned slightly as I drank, but it sharpened my focus rather than dulling it. I pulled out the photo albums Maria had meticulously maintained, finding pictures of David as a child. There he was at 8 years old, wearing my old construction helmet at a building site. At 12, helping me review blueprints in this very study. At 16, telling his friends how his father built Manhattan. When had that pride turned to shame? I closed the album and moved to my filing cabinet, retrieving the folder labeled David Business Records. As his father and financial mentor, I had helped establish his agency, guaranteed his initial loans, and provided business connections that formed his client base. Everything I had done to launch his career had been done with love and pride. Now those same records would serve a different purpose. My laptop hummed to life as I began downloading financial documents I had previously ignored. Bank statements, tax filings, client contracts. All the paperwork David had asked me to review when I had time. I had trusted him completely, never questioning his business practices or examining details too closely. Trust. Another mistake I would not repeat. The evening stretched ahead of me, and for the first time since receiving that wedding invitation, I felt completely clear about what needed to happen next. David had made his choice about our relationship when he decided I wasn't suitable for his important day. Tomorrow, I would begin making choices about his. My alarm hadn't been necessary. I had been awake since 5, sitting at my kitchen table with coffee and a legal pad, organizing questions that needed answers. By 9:30, I was dressed and driving toward my Wall Street office through Manhattan's quiet Sunday streets. The Harris Properties building stood empty except for weekend security. I nodded to Michael at the front desk and took the elevator to my private floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of the financial district. I started with my Rolodex, an old-fashioned tool that had served me well through decades of deals. Tom Anderson answered on the second ring, his voice cautious when he realized who was calling. I explained that I needed to ask him something confidential and asked if he had attended my son's wedding yesterday. The pause stretched uncomfortably before he replied. He said he thought I knew about the change. I asked what change he was talking about. He told me that David had mentioned I was dealing with health issues and couldn't attend, something about doctor's orders. I set down my pen carefully and said that I had never felt better in my life. Tom swore and explained that David had said our family thought it would be better to keep things small this time, more intimate without the older generation there. The older generation. Translation, without me. I thanked Tom and immediately dialed Sarah Johnson, who had catered several Harris Properties events. Her voice brightened when she recognized mine. then faltered as my questions continued. She confirmed it was a beautiful ceremony. She said that David had specifically requested elegant but exclusive and that he mentioned wanting to protect family privacy. I asked how many guests were there, and she said about 200. 200 people at an intimate ceremony that somehow excluded the groom's father. I made notes in my journal, tracking each conversation, building a picture of systematic deception. Marcus Allen, my own attorney, had the decency to sound guilty. He explained that David had approached him directly. He said that David had told him there were family complications and asked if he could attend as a family friend rather than my representative. I asked exactly what he had said about these complications. Marcus said that David had told him we had disagreements about the wedding style and that Emily's family preferred a more contemporary approach. Contemporary, code for being embarrassed by the old man's traditional values. By noon, I had spoken with 8 people who had attended my son's wedding. Each had received a different explanation for my absence, but the pattern was clear. David had spent weeks crafting stories to exclude me while preserving his relationships with my business connections. The final call went to Robert Lee, whose architectural firm had designed David's agency offices. I asked him if David had seemed stressed about family issues at the wedding. He said no, that he actually didn't. He seemed relieved, if anything, as if a weight had been lifted. Emily looked radiant, and they both appeared very happy with how everything had turned out. I sat back in my leather chair, surrounded by the awards and photographs that documented my business career. For 40 years, I had built relationships, created opportunities, and established the foundation that had made David's success possible. Now, he had used those very connections to celebrate without me, convincing my own associates that I was the problem. The afternoon sun shifted across my desk as I opened my laptop and began a different kind of investigation. David's business operated in a world of contracts, invoices, tax filings, and financial reports. Everything left traces. It was time to follow those traces and discover exactly what my son had been hiding. Monday morning brought a renewed sense of purpose. I arrived at the office early and spent an hour preparing before my advisors arrived. By 2 o'clock, Michael Rodriguez and Sam Leben sat across from me at the conference table, surrounded by documents I had gathered over the weekend. I kept my voice neutral and professional as I told them I needed a comprehensive review of my family's business arrangements, treating it as a standard audit. Michael began with David's financial files, his accountant's eyes scanning the columns of numbers with practiced efficiency. After 20 minutes, he looked up with concern. The figures, he explained, did not align with standard business practices. The income reporting showed significant inconsistencies. I gestured for him to show me. He spread 3 years of tax returns across the mahogany surface, pointing to specific entries. He noted that David had reported only $340,000 in agency income for 2024, but the bank statements showed deposits totaling over $900,000. He was concerned about where the difference had gone, pointing out multiple transfers to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, shell corporations with minimal documentation. Sam leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he examined the paperwork. He observed that this pattern suggested deliberate tax evasion, not simple bookkeeping errors. I maintained my composure, even though my pulse had quickened. I asked them what would happen if these discrepancies were discovered by authorities. Sam explained that the IRS would launch an immediate investigation. He said that with amounts this substantial, we were looking at potential criminal charges and prison time. Michael nodded grimly, adding that the offshore component made it worse. He said that federal prosecutors treat hidden foreign accounts very seriously. I photographed each document methodically with my phone, creating a comprehensive digital record. David's agency had flourished using my business connections, but apparently, my son had decided those same relationships were not worth maintaining legally. Michael continued, pulling out client contracts. He said that several agreements showed cash payments without proper documentation. That, he explained, was money laundering territory if the amounts were significant enough. I asked how significant we were talking about, based on the records. He estimated it was potentially over $2 million in unreported income across 3 years. The irony struck me forcefully. I had offered David $1 million as an honest wedding gift, money earned through legitimate business. He had apparently been hiding twice that amount through illegal schemes. Sam gathered the papers into neat stacks. He asked me if I was considering reporting this to U.S. authorities. I stood and walked to the window, looking down at Wall Street's afternoon activity. Traders and analysts hurried between buildings, conducting their business within legal boundaries because they understood the consequences. I told them I was considering many things. For now, I just needed to understand what my son had been doing with the advantages I had provided him. Michael and Sam exchanged glances. They had worked with me long enough to recognize my tone when I was planning something significant. Michael offered to prepare a complete analysis, with every transaction documented and every irregularity highlighted. I told him to do that and reminded them that this conversation was to remain confidential until I decided otherwise. They nodded and began packing their materials. After they left, I sat alone with the evidence spread before me, understanding that David had handed me something more valuable than hurt feelings. On Tuesday morning, I called David's office and spoke to his assistant with perfect calm. I asked her to tell David that his father would like to discuss our misunderstanding over dinner tonight at 7:30 at Bella in the village. I chose the restaurant deliberately. It was the same place where I had taken him for birthday dinners when he was young enough to order chicken fingers without shame. The irony felt appropriate. David arrived 15 minutes late, scanning the intimate dining room nervously before he spotted me in the corner booth. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and his tie was slightly askew. The confident son from the Instagram photos had been replaced by someone who looked like he hadn't slept well. He slid into the seat across from me, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He thanked me for calling and said he had been hoping we could talk. I asked if he had been, and signaled the waiter to order a bottle of Burlo, David's favorite wine from our previous dinners here. I thought to myself that he must be too busy with honeymoon plans to talk. He started to explain that there were complications with the venue scheduling and that Emily's family had strong preferences about timing. I stopped him, my voice level, almost gentle. I told him we both knew better than that. The wine arrived, providing a momentary distraction as the waiter performed the tasting ritual. David's hands trembled slightly as he picked up his glass, and I noticed he didn't actually drink from it. I told him I had brought him something, and I retrieved the envelope from my jacket pocket. It was a wedding present. His face brightened with relief and greed. He insisted I hadn't needed to bring anything. I opened the envelope carefully and emptied its contents onto the white tablecloth between us. Dozens of paper fragments scattered like confetti across the surface, some pieces small enough to flutter in the air conditioning. David stared at the debris, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition to horror as he realized what he was seeing. This, I explained quietly, was his wedding gift, a cashier's check for $1 million. I had destroyed it Saturday night. He said I was insane. The words came out strangled, barely a whisper. He told me he needed that money. I told him he needed many things: my respect, my trust, and my presence at his wedding. I leaned back against the leather banquet, completely relaxed while he struggled to process what he had lost. Instead, I said, he had chosen embarrassment. He lunged forward, trying to gather the pieces with both hands. He insisted it was fixable, that banks could reissue it. I calmly moved the envelope beyond his reach. I explained that they could not, that I had specifically requested a non-replaceable status. He accused me of destroying $1 million out of spite. I told him I had destroyed the illusion that he deserved what he never earned. I finished my wine while he sat frozen. Fragments of his inheritance still clung to his fingers. I told him that starting tomorrow, he would discover what independence actually costs. He got up abruptly, knocking his chair backward. He said he would regret this and that he didn't need my money anymore. I simply said, "We'll see about that." Other diners turned to watch as he stormed toward the exit, leaving me alone with the scattered remains of his future. I signaled for the check and waited patiently, already anticipating tomorrow's phone calls. Wednesday morning found me in my office by 7, 2 hours before my secretary typically arrived. I used the quiet time to organize paperwork and prepare for what would be the most important business day of my week. Judith Green appeared at 9 sharp, coffee in hand, and already reviewing my calendar. She greeted me and confirmed my appointment with First National for 10 o'clock. I confirmed it was perfect and instructed her that I would be unavailable for all calls from David Harris indefinitely, and that she should refer him to my voicemail. Her eyebrows rose slightly, but she simply nodded. 40 years of working together had taught her not to question my business decisions. Peter Adams welcomed me into the bank's executive conference room at precisely 10 o'clock. We had done business together since the 80s, when I was still borrowing money to buy my first properties instead of depositing millions from their sale. I told him that I was there to revoke all personal guarantees on Harris Media Solutions accounts. I slid the paperwork across the polished table, documents my lawyer, Sam Leben, had prepared overnight. Peter examined the forms carefully. He told me that this represented a $2 million credit facility and that my son's business depended on this line. I said that I was aware of the implications. He noted that this could force his agency into bankruptcy within weeks and asked if I was certain about this decision. I said I was completely certain. I signed the documents while Peter watched, his expression troubled but professional. I asked how quickly he could implement the revocation. He said they would notify Harris Media by noon today and that the credit freeze would be effective immediately. I stood and shook his hand, thanking him and insisting that this was strictly business, nothing personal. Back at my office, Judith intercepted me before I reached my suite. She informed me that David had called 6 times since I left, and that he sounded quite agitated. I'll bet he does, I thought to myself, and asked what she had told him. She said she had told him I was in meetings through the end of the week, as instructed. My phone began ringing as we spoke. Judith glanced at the display and shook her head. That was him again. I told her to let it go to voicemail. I spent the afternoon reviewing real estate portfolios, conducting normal business while David's world imploded 20 blocks south. Each call from his number went unanswered, and each voicemail remained unheard. By 5 o'clock, Judith reported 19 attempted contacts. The last message was quite heated, she mentioned diplomatically. I told her there was no need to transcribe it, as I could imagine the content. As Manhattan's business day wound down around us, I walked to my window and looked out at the financial district. Somewhere in that maze of glass and steel, my son was probably discovering that independence carried a price tag he couldn't afford. Tomorrow would bring the next phase of his education. The federal building security checkpoint took longer than expected on Thursday morning. I had to go through metal detectors and X-ray machines, and the guards treated every visitor like a potential threat. I carried only my briefcase and identification, but the inspection process still took 15 minutes. Inspector Mark Thompson's office was on the 15th floor, overlooking the East River through reinforced windows. Government-issued furniture and fluorescent lighting created an atmosphere of institutional authority that perfectly suited my purposes. Mark Thompson greeted me and said that my call yesterday had mentioned tax irregularities. He gestured to the chair across from his metal desk where a stack of blank forms waited. I explained that I had documented evidence of systematic tax evasion. I opened my briefcase and began arranging documents in chronological order, creating a timeline of David's financial crimes. These records, I explained, spanned 3 years of deliberate fraud. Thompson examined the bank statements first, his trained eye immediately catching the discrepancies Michael had identified. The deposit amounts, he noted, did not match the reported business income. Not even close. I told him that my son had been routing money through Cayman Islands corporations, avoiding approximately 60% of his tax obligations. I told him that I was not reporting a family member, but rather criminal activity that just happened to involve a family member. I maintained eye contact, letting him see my resolve. I told him that personal relationships don't excuse fraud. Thompson spent 40 minutes reviewing every document, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. The evidence Michael and Sam had helped me organize told a clear story of deliberate deception, false business expenses, hidden client payments, and offshore accounts designed to conceal income. This is substantial, he finally said. We'll begin immediate investigation procedures. I asked him for the timeline for cases this well documented. He replied that they would have agents at Harris Media Solutions by Monday morning. Bank records, he said, would be subpoenaed and accounts frozen pending investigation. I signed the formal complaint and provided my contact information as a cooperating witness. The paperwork felt oddly satisfying. Each signature represented another step away from the father David had rejected. Mr. Harris, Thompson said, investigations like this typically take months to resolve. Are you prepared for that duration? Inspector Thompson, I replied. I've spent 40 years building my business reputation on patience and persistence. I'm prepared for whatever timeline justice requires. He walked me to the elevator, promising regular updates on the investigation's progress. As the doors closed, I caught my reflection in the polished metal, a man who had just weaponized the federal government against his own son. The building's lobby bustled with afternoon activity as I signed out at security. Government employees hurried past with folders and briefcases, conducting the business of justice in their methodical institutional way. Inspector Thompson called my office at 2 o'clock Friday afternoon. "Mr. Harris," he said, "we're executing the warrant in approximately 2 hours. Thought you'd want to know." I thanked him and hung up, then walked to my window overlooking Wall Street's afternoon activity. David would be in his Soho office, probably meeting with clients, completely unaware that his professional world was about to implode. The clock on my desk read 4:15 when my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Drummond. "Robert," it read, "there are federal agents at David's office. Thought you should know." I poured myself coffee and waited. At Harris Media Solutions, according to later reports, the raid began during David's presentation to a celebrity client. 6 IRS agents entered through the reception area with warrants and badges, transforming his trendy converted warehouse into a federal crime scene within minutes. Agent Sarah Chun led the operation with bureaucratic efficiency, directing her team to specific computers and filing cabinets, while David stood frozen beside his conference table. His client, a Broadway actor whose political campaign David managed, gathered his materials and left without explanation. "This is completely unnecessary," David told the agents as they photographed documents and seized hard drives. "I can provide whatever information you need voluntarily." "Sir, please step aside while we complete our evidence collection," Chun replied, boxing client files with methodical precision. David's 12 employees watched from their cubicles as federal agents dismantled 3 years of business operations. Phone calls stopped mid-sentence. Creative brainstorming sessions dissolved into confused whispers. By 5:30, the agency resembled a corporate archaeological dig rather than Manhattan's most innovative PR firm. My phone finally rang at 6 o'clock. "You orchestrated this." David's voice was raw with fury and exhaustion. "Somehow you arranged this raid. Federal investigations operate independently, David. I don't control government agencies. The timing is too convenient. First my credit disappears, now this. Perhaps you should have considered consequences before betraying family trust. They won't find anything illegal." I let the silence stretch between us, listening to his ragged breathing. Through my office window, Manhattan's lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "Actually, David, they'll find exactly what I discovered. The question is whether you prefer criminal prosecution or professional bankruptcy. This isn't over." "You're absolutely right. It isn't." The line went dead, and I sat back in my chair, satisfied with the day's progress. Phase 3 was complete. Tomorrow would bring the weekend, giving David time to fully appreciate his new reality. Monday would introduce him to the final lesson about family loyalty and its consequences. David's desperation brought him to my apartment Saturday evening. Emily trailed behind with the defeated posture of someone who'd spent the day listening to her husband's increasingly frantic phone calls. I opened the door to find them both disheveled. David's usually perfect hair unkempt. Emily's designer clothes wrinkled from a day of crisis management. Their faces showed the strain of 48 hours spent watching his business empire crumble. "We need to talk." David pushed past me into the living room without invitation, Emily following with an apologetic glance in my direction. "Please sit down." I gestured to the sofa where David had spent countless childhood Sundays, back when he'd believed his father could solve any problem. "Can I offer you anything? Coffee? Wine?" "Cut the hospitality act," David snapped, pacing beside the fireplace where his graduation photos still hung. "You know why we're here." Emily positioned herself carefully between us, her journalist instincts recognizing dangerous territory. "Mr. Harris, surely we can resolve this situation as adults, as family." "Family." I repeated the word thoughtfully, settling into my leather chair. "That's precisely what we need to discuss." From my side table, I retrieved the envelope containing the check fragments and placed it on the coffee table between us. Emily's eyes widened as she recognized the scattered pieces. "This was David's wedding present," I explained calmly. $1 million that I destroyed after discovering his betrayal. "Dad, please." David stopped pacing, his voice cracking slightly. "I can fix this." The agency is salvageable if I can just restore the credit line. Why would I help someone who considers me an embarrassment? Emily leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly. There must have been a misunderstanding about the wedding invitations. People make mistakes when they're stressed. No mistake. I met her eyes directly. Your husband spent weeks crafting lies to exclude me from his special day. He told my own business associates that I was inappropriate for the occasion. David collapsed onto the sofa, his earlier bravado evaporating. The wedding planning got complicated. Emily's family had opinions about guest lists. Stop lying to me. The sharpness in my voice cut through his excuses. For a moment, we stared at each other across the ruins of our relationship. Emily looked between us uncertainly, finally understanding that this conflict ran deeper than wounded pride. What do you want? David's question came out as a whisper. I want you to experience consequences. For 40 years, I've protected you from failure, provided opportunities, guaranteed your success. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at Central Park, where families still gathered for weekend activities. You decided that protection was worthless. Now you'll discover what life looks like without it. I'll destroy your reputation if you don't stop this. I turned back to face him, and something in my expression made him shrink against the sofa cushions. Try me. Monday morning began with phone calls to journalists I'd cultivated over 4 decades of New York real estate development. Sarah Martinez at the Times, Frank Weber at the Post, Jennifer Chung from Business Week. Each received identical manila envelopes containing David's financial records and a timeline of his tax evasion scheme. Sarah, I have an exclusive story about corruption in the PR industry, I told the Times reporter who'd covered my major development projects since the 90s. What kind of corruption? She asked. Tax fraud, offshore accounts, celebrity client money laundering, the works. By noon, David's phone was ringing with interview requests he couldn't dodge. By 2 o'clock, the first online stories appeared with headlines like Manhattan PR agency under federal investigation and celebrity publicist accused of $1 million tax scheme. I watched the news cycle accelerate from my office, monitoring social media as David's professional reputation disintegrated in real time. His agency's Instagram account, once filled with glamorous client events, now attracted comments from reporters seeking statements about criminal allegations. The Broadway actor who had witnessed Friday's raid issued a public statement through his manager. We are immediately terminating our relationship with Harris Media Solutions pending resolution of these serious allegations. 2 political candidates followed within hours. At 4 o'clock, David called me directly. Congratulations. His voice carried exhaustion rather than anger now. You've accomplished what you wanted. Have I? What exactly did I want, David? To ruin my life completely. No. I wanted my son to understand that actions carry consequences, that family loyalty matters, that betrayal has a price. You taught me that lesson when you excluded me from your wedding. I simply returned the favor. The agency, he said, was finished. His staff had cleared out that morning, and his reputation was destroyed. Then you'll have plenty of time to think about what you lost when you decided I wasn't worthy of your important day. A silent stretched between us, filled with the weight of 40 years of relationship damage that couldn't be undone with apologies or explanations. Will you ever forgive me? I considered the question carefully, looking at Linda's photograph on my desk. She would have found another way, would have built bridges instead of destroying them. But Linda wasn't here to see her son dismiss everything we'd built together. David, forgiveness requires remorse for actual wrongs, not regret about consequences. When you understand the difference, call me again. I hung up and opened the evening edition of the Times, where David's downfall occupied 3 columns on the business page. The photograph showed him leaving his former office building, briefcase in hand, looking exactly like what he'd become, a fallen executive, learning that independence without integrity carried its own punishment. Outside my window, Manhattan pulsed with its eternal rhythm of ambition and consequence, success and failure. 40 years of building my empire had taught me that both outcomes required careful planning and flawless execution. I just provided my son with a masterclass in both.